Kicking off this episode of ClubCast, we will be talking about the MLB Trade Deadline. With less than 2 weeks ago, we will talk all the big names and a few surprises along the way. I'm Cody, that's Jake, and this is ClubCast, the official podcast from the Diamond Club. So, kicking it off, compared to other sports, I've always thought the MLB Trade Deadline is the most interesting.
Yeah.
Just because so many big names get moved compared to other sports. Like football, it's really hard to see someone get moved that's a big star player at their trade deadline. Basketball can be a little exciting, but I just think baseball, especially the
Yeah.
past couple years, we've seen so many big stars get traded. And this season, I think comparing it to last year with the new wild card format, I think it's a lot more interesting to see what teams are going to do, because now a lot of teams are going to go off of what they saw last year and how to kind of guide them how they're going to do this trade deadline. So I don't know how
Right.
you feel about that. I mean, like, you're a Phillies fan, you saw what they did at the deadline, and really what me and other Dodger fans have always said is that I think you kind of just need to get in now, and that kind of affects the mentality of a lot of teams, because I think a lot of teams think they can get by with what they have. So I'm kind of interested to see how many buyers and sellers are, but there is a market out there for players that are going to be on the move. We've already heard a bunch of stuff. So, I mean, like, what's your thoughts on this trade deadline?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it on the head. It's this expanded playoff picture now, so everybody feels like they can be in. But, I like you said, I think the only big moves that really will go on will be those teams at the top end, like the Braves or the Dodgers or the people that need that extra push for the championship. Not the people like last year, like the Phillies, who were like, "Let's get in, see what happens." Like those kinds of teams, you could see little moves, relievers, things like that. But I think there might be some interesting things where we'll touch on later. But yeah, I think this is going to be a big one.
Well, just to get started with questions, one of the first things you have to ask is, who are the contenders, who are the buyers, and who are the sellers? And I think beginning the season compared to where we are now, there's a lot of surprises, both good and bad for certain teams. Um, And I would say, who are we going to say? Who are the big buyers? Obviously, the Braves are going to be in there. Obviously, the Dodgers are going to be in there. Pretty much any team that's either first or second or within that wild card push is going to be in there. But I think the bigger question is, who are going to be the sellers? Because the two biggest question marks I have, just because I still feel like if they get hot, they could make a run, are the Padres and the Mets.
I knew what you were
And
going to say before you even say
and
it.
they have a lot of assets to sell. But who do you think would be the big sellers in the National League if it's not those two?
uh, you know, we talked about it. I know Phillies, Dodgers. The Cardinals. I think the Cardinals have to sell at this point. I think that's a weak division, but the Reds are just so hot. The Brewers are a good team. I mean, they just took 2 or 3 from the Phillies. It's I think the Cardinals just have to be out. That's in the NL at least. In the AL, I have a few teams. I think the White Sox. It's bound to happen. I mean, we've seen it for a couple of years now. Giolito, Cease, people like that have been talked about. But the Royals have a lot of good talent. I think that they could dish off to try to get some pieces back.
Yeah, and then that kind of goes off to going down position by position. We'll start off with starting pitching, which is probably going to be the most sought after position this year. I mean, everybody needs pitching, whether it be relief pitching or starting pitching, but there seems to be a very high amount of teams that need starting pitching, and there's a very low amount that's on the market. So it's a
Right.
seller's market right now. These terrible teams, these teams that are on the outside looking in, they have starting pitchers that they can trade to these contenders. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
matter, are they going to meet that asking price? So speaking of me, for who I have as like the top starting pitchers on the move, I mean, you have your obvious names out there. Just to get it off the bat, Lucas Giolito.
Of course.
He seems like he's definitely going to get moved this deadline. He's a
Mm-hmm.
pure rental. He's only there for half the season. Wherever team he gets called, he gets traded to. I just think with, like how you said, the White Sox, how they've been playing the past two years, they kind of
Yep.
have to blow it up. It
Right.
just depends on how much are they blowing it up. But Giolito is definitely a guy I think could definitely be traded. Just looking at his stats for the year, he's got a 3.96 ERA in 116 innings pitched. His ERA plus is 111, which is above league average. But the one thing about him is that he's not going to go for a lot just because he is a free agency.
Right. I wrote the same thing.
But then you could also argue his teammate Dylan Cease, and this is just going off of how much of a sell mode are the White Sox going to go in? How deep is their farm system? It's not one of the highest strengths as it has been in recent years. So you could consider trading Cease. He is having a down year. He's got an ERA over 4, but he's had some starts that have shown what the Cy Young contender that he was last year. I find it hard that he may get moved just because he has at least, I believe it's 2.5 years of control left. So the White Sox kind of have to see, are we going to be contending in the next 2.5 years? I don't think they will, but it's completely up to them. If they want to move them, they could always wait until the off season where they can probably get a little bit more. But it's just depending on when you want to sell. I would say if you asked me like a couple weeks ago, Shane Bieber would have been one of my guys. But me and you even talked about just because he has elbow discomfort now, he's put on the IL. I don't think the Guardians are going to trade him. It's something that they would do just to trade away a guy who's almost, I believe he has 1 year left after this year, get him at his max value, get some prospects in return that they don't have to pay a lot of money for. But I think the big one that I've been pushing for is Jordan Montgomery off the Cardinals. You know, he's a free agent at the end of the year. I think the big thing for the Cardinals is that they're going to sell off those guys that are on an expiring contract. And Montgomery's been doing really good. It just seems like a no-brainer to trade him away. And the Cardinals desperately need pitching for the future. And he could get you a good low-end prospect. Nothing crazy, but he's definitely a serviceable arm.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it right on the head. I want to touch on Dylan Cease first because you were right. 2 years. He's got 2 years more of arbitration left. But right next to it, I wrote dog because that's just what he is. You see a 4.18 ERA, and I wrote might shrink his value. I mean, honestly, like what you said, the 4.18 ERA could scare the White Sox. But this guy, he's got dirty stuff. Like we both know it. We're both running for him. But I actually went to the other side of Chicago for 2 pitchers as well. Stroman and Hendricks. I mean, I think it's about due at this point. Stroman came out saying how much he loves, playing in Chicago, him and Cody. But, they have too much value. That team's not going to compete. Just like the Cardinals, it's not going to compete. I think Kyle Hendricks is really underrated. He's a free agent after the year. He's got a club option after the year, so he's a free agent after the year. $16 million, but 3.38 ERA, excellent command, low walks. I think as a 4 or 5 on one of these playoff teams, it could be really good.
Yeah, Marcus Stroman's probably been having the most consistent year in the National League in terms of pitchers. Kind of goes unnoticed for some reason.
Right.
He can be a little bit of a hothead. We've seen how he's played in other teams, but he usually backs up his stuff.
Yeah.
He puts it out, talks it back up, and I think he definitely will get traded because it doesn't look like the Cubs are going to extend him. If you're not going to extend him, you might as well sell him off for the most value. I actually like the idea of Kyle Hendricks being moved. I thought he was going to get moved all those other years when the Cubs were kind of in flux.
Right.
This year, I guess it would seem like a no-brainer. I'm not too sure how long he has left on his contract. He has to be a free agent soon.
He's got a club option next year, so they can opt out if you want.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, he's definitely – I'm pretty sure he's not going to blow you away with his stuff, but he's one of those finesse pitchers that curveball.
Command.
I like the stuff that he has. He's always one of those guys that can definitely give you innings, and a lot of these teams don't really need to get a top-end starter. A lot of these teams need to get someone that can just eat innings because I just don't see many top-of-the-end starters getting traded away this deadline just because of how many teams are technically still in contention.
Right. I agree.
But yeah, I definitely like the Kyle Hendricks being mentioned there. And then Dylan Cease, if the White Sox are going to go all selling, I think that's someone you could sell for a lot. ERA, I'm kind of 50-50 on. As long as it's not too high, you kind of got to look at
Right.
some of the starts. And Dylan Cease has had a couple of really bad starts. I know last month against the Dodgers, I think he gave up 6 or 7 runs, but he had like 12 strikeouts. And then he'll have another start where he goes 6 or 7 innings, no runs. So you kind of just want to see some consistency there, but I definitely agree with all that.
Yeah.
And
I think
then,
the bigger question is this reliever class. I mean, every year it's like you're throwing darts almost at a board. I mean, you already saw Chapman move. We saw Genesis Cabrera move today from the Cardinals, but there's just so many guys. It's hard to pin down one. But why not stay in Chicago? Kendall Graveman, he's nasty. Another Chicago pitcher who's nasty, who's probably going to get traded. I mean, a 2.12 ERA in his last 30 games. 30
yeah,
games. That's pitching every day for a month. 2 ERA. Texas could use another arm, get a little deeper. I mean, you see other teams. Dodgers could use some pitching. Phillies could use some pitching. I think relievers are going to move, but I think Kendall Graveman's definitely a factor. We talked about another one, Scott Barlow. I was talking about the Royals earlier, how they have some talent. He's got real good breaking stuff. He throws a slider, I think 45% of the time. That's going to be another one. Another guy who would look good in a Rangers jersey. But the AL East is real tight too, so they could use some pitching out there. And then one guy I don't particularly like, hard head and hard thrower, Jordan Hicks from the Cardinals, another selling team. It's like we're beating these teams up, but like we said earlier, a lot of teams think they're in. So there's not many teams that are going to be sellers. I think I had 5 teams written down that might sell. But Jordan Hicks, hard thrower, decent ERA. He does lack some command. But when you throw a 100-mile-an-hour sinker, somebody's going to want you.
yeah. The relief pitchers, they always go for so much at the trade deadline, probably over market value. So it's kind of like, is it a necessity for your team?
Right.
There's a couple teams that definitely need bullpen help, and there's a couple guys that are out there. And I agree with you 100%, Jordan Hicks. I mean, we're just chopping the Cardinals up here. They got to sell if they're going to really. From what we've heard, is that the Cardinals are selling to compete for next year. So you should be selling off your rental pieces, and that's exactly what Jordan Hicks is. He's a rental. He only has half a season of control left, so you get him just for the rest of this year and into October. And like what you said, he does struggle with command, but when he's on, he's on. I mean, and just the short sample size he's in, he's only he doesn't have that many innings compared to other closers and relief pitchers, but he has almost top of the strikeouts in terms of that.
Right.
He's got 58 on the year. He can blow it by you. I mean, he throws 100 plus for almost every pitch that he has. And then obviously the big one, I'm not too sure if he'll get traded, but I feel like he needs to, is the Pirates closer, David Bednar. He's been putting up a league closer on a team that's not going to make the playoffs this year, or probably not next year. Doesn't make sense to have. You might as well sell high. The thing with him that makes it kind of 50-50 if the Pirates will sell him is he has 3.5 years of control left, which I thought was a lot. I didn't realize it was that long. So you're getting pretty much an elite all-star closer for not just the rest of this year, but the next 3 years, which for teams that are looking for a closer and someone to put in those high leverage situations, that's going to be a big asking price. The Pirates could definitely get a lot of prospects for that one pitcher. And, the Pirates, like I said, they're not going to compete this year. They're not going to compete next year. They'll be taking steps to, but they should just be selling off pieces that they don't need. Because relief pitching it's so futile that you don't know what you're going to get the very next season. So there's a very good chance that these relief pitchers could either be super elite or they could be awful. And
Exactly.
you kind of have to sell high with these types of guys. So I would definitely put those two on there.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan Hicks, pretty obvious. You said 58 strikeouts. That's in 40 games. So that's, what you were saying is right. Top of the league in strikeouts. And then David Bednar, I didn't even think about him. you thought he'd be gone by now. You know what I mean? It's been a couple years now that where he after he broke out that the Pirates are spamming trade rumors with him and Brian Reynolds. But I agree with you. I think they both have to go this trade deadline.
Yeah, and relief pitching, it's always going to be a high, like asking price, like I said. It just depends on, do you really need it? Some teams
Mhm.
think that they can fill these holes from within. And sometimes you just have to go all in if you want to win the World Series. And there's a lot of good relief pitching out there. Like you said, the Rangers are they're looking at all these relief pitchers right here to straightening up their bullpen. The Diamondbacks, I know, have been linked to a bunch of names. They need starting
Mhm.
pitching and they need bullpen help. And then just the way the Dodgers, their bullpen has been so inconsistent this year. You could say they could get any one of these guys that we mentioned. So I think those are all good names. I would say moving on and shifting to probably something that's a little even more thinner is the position
Mhm.
player side. Um, there's a bunch of names you can mention, but I just feel like this deadline, it doesn't feel like there's that many star names that can realistically get moved. I mean, we're coming off years where Juan Soto was moved last year, and then Max Scherzer and Trey Turner moved the year before. I don't think the
Right.
Nationals have many other players to move on right now, so there's kind of not many star players that are going to get moved, but I think there's role players that can be moved that are on these teams that can help out a contender. So I'm interested to see what you say for position players.
I mean, yeah, I agree with you. It's real thin. I wrote actual notes on 3 players, and then I wrote a couple other people's names down just in case, just in case you said the same ones. But like I said, it's real thin, and I feel bad about it. But we're going back to St. Louis. Tyler O'Neill had a big issue early in the season with the coach. Bad blood over there. Coming back now, but you also have Dylan Carlson, Jordan Walker. You have a jammed outfield out there. You have 4 outfielders. I think one of them probably goes. I'd like to think it was Tyler O'Neill because he's nearing the end of a deal. Yeah, I think 2025 is when he's up, and just with the bad blood, I think Dylan Carlson's under contract till 2027, so it's going to be a whole different kind of trade for that guy. The second one actually that I said was something that happened, quite recently. Yasmani Grandal, another Chicago guy, but the Yankees just lost Jose Trevino. So
He's
who's
been
gonna
awful
catch the
anyway, so
right? But who's gonna catch from now? You know, I think the Yankees were one of those teams that we kind of skipped out on the pitching because I think they're not gonna like being down there in the AL East. But Yasmani Grandal, another guy on the team that's just mid, and that could really be a guy that could impact that lineup out there in New York. And I have to do it before you do, Cody Bellinger. Cody Bellinger, I need him to be a Philly. He's hitting 300 plus versus lefties. He just hit another home run today that was a bomb in the Wrigleyville jerseys. He's got so much talent and so little value because he's half a year. He's going to get a big contract in the offseason, most likely. He fits a lot of teams with the positional flexibility, too. He's young. He's fast. There's nothing not to like about Cody.
Yeah, continuing off Bellinger, it just seems like he needed a change of scenery.
Right.
He struggled his last 2 seasons in LA, and a lot of it just because I've seen it close up. I'm in the Dodger verse, kind of seeing what he's went through. A lot of it was injuries. A lot of it was just coming back, then injuring something else. Like between 2021 and 2022, he had the shoulder injury from the 2020
Mhm.
playoff run. He fractured his leg in 2021. Then he had, I
Right.
believe, there was another injury that he was having. Maybe it was a hamstring or a knee injury
Yeah.
that kind of was lingering through him all year. And then 21, he had a really good playoff run. He was the best Dodgers hitter that
Mhm.
postseason. And then 2022 was kind of just the first year that he was fully healthy, and it just didn't seem like everything went his way. And then he ended up getting platooned, and then he ended up getting benched in the playoffs. Once he didn't start Game 4 of the NLDS, I kind of knew it was
Mhm.
pretty much over his tenure there. But I'm happy that he's come back. Him and Christian Yelich have both kind
Yeah.
of, they're not. MVP form, but they're all-star perform.
He had
And
3/4 of the cycle on 3 pitches the other day against the Phillies. I think that's an MVP for me.
yeah, so it's good to see those guys back because in 2019, I mean, that was probably the best
Right.
MVP race in recent memory I could think of, just because
Yeah,
they
I
were kind
agree.
of matching each other every game. They were going back and forth between the standings and stats and stuff. So it's good to see them back. But definitely Bellinger, he's getting traded. I
Yeah.
would be shocked if the Cubs kept him. If you're not going to try to extend him like right now, and he's not going to because his agent Scott Boras, and he won't sign an extension.
Yeah.
He has a club. I think he has a player option for $26 million next year, or 25 million, and he's definitely going to not
Right.
take that. He's definitely going to test the market. He's going to want a longer deal. I don't think he's going to get a huge contract, but he definitely will get something at least 5 years, maybe
Yeah.
25 million new year, especially with the way he's played this year. And he plays elite defense, first base, center field, corner, outfield. He can play anywhere. And then him batting 300 is a pretty big thing. He was never really an average hitter. It seems like he's a better all-around hitter this year, especially like how you mentioned he's hitting over 300 against lefties.
Yep.
That was unheard of when he was in LA. So
Remember.
he's definitely made some adjustments. So, and then I would say shifting back to another team is the Red Sox, and it kind of they're off to a really hot July. I believe they only lost 2 or 3 games so far, so it's looking less and less likely that they're going to sell, especially with the Yankees kind of taking a turn for the worst and going all the way from, I believe they were in 3rd place, now they're in last place.
Yeah.
I would have said Adam Duvall. That's definitely a guy who has played a lot of places the past 3 or 4 years. He's a good right-handed power bat. And then another name that kind of isn't really getting mentioned, but is on the Mets, and we don't feel the best about him, but Tommy Pham.
I wrote it down. Tommy Pham.
He's having a really good year. And the Mets could realistically sell him and not be selling. They could just open up some spots on their roster. And there's a lot of teams, including the Dodgers, that need a right-handed bat, specifically in the outfield. So he's definitely someone I can see getting moved as well. And then my last one, which I think is the most likely if it's a superstar that's going to get moved, it's probably Paul Goldschmidt in terms of position players. So the Cardinals have to think, are we going to be realistically competing next year? And when I think of competing, it doesn't mean winning around 80 games. It means, all right, are we going to win the NL Central next year?
Right.
Are we going to make a wild card? If Paul Goldschmidt isn't in those plans, then you might as well just trade him, especially when he has a year and a half left of control. I don't see them trading Nolan Arenado. I don't think many teams are going to want to take on the remainder of his contract, which is at $124 million over the next 5 years. He's pretty much going to stay there. He could realistically help them in the next 3 years in their playoff runs. But Goldschmidt, he's not getting younger. I think he's like 35, 36 years old. You might as well trade him to a contender. He can still hit. And if you're going to blow it up, you can get a lot of good prospects, and they're going to need pitching. So he can get you a good pitching prospect. So that's where I would go with that one.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on the Paul Goldschmidt is more likely to be moved than Nolan. I also agree with you that I don't think either of them are moved. And of course, Adam Duvall, we've been talking about it for a month now. We both in on him. Big power bat off the bench. Like you said, though, hot July, really tight division race out there. We posted some things on Twitter, the Diamond Club Zero, about how tight that race was in the AL East. But, you hit it right on the head. And then, of course, Tommy Pham. Can't forget about Tommy Pham. Like you said, under-the-radar guy, but honestly can do most things well. Throws well, runs well, catches well, hits well. Just a guy you like to have, off your bench.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And then shifting from position players, this is kind of where we kind of we put our thinking caps on. We start thinking of blockbuster trades that could happen this deadline. We've had a bunch that we've already mentioned. Definitely Juan Soto last year after contract negotiations failed. Kind of figured he was going to get traded. didn't think it was going to happen until it happened at last minute, and the Padres swooped in and traded for him. The deadline prior, like I said, Max Scherzer and Trey Turner. Max Scherzer made sense, but then when Trey Turner was put in there, it was
just thrown in.
everyone kind of put a question mark in that. So, what do you think are some potential shocking trades that could happen this deadline?
I'll tell you the two that I don't think will happen, and then I'll tell you the two that I think have the higher likelihood. One, Paul Goldschmidt, Nolan Arenado. I don't think it's going to happen. It would have to be a haul, and the Cardinals would have to really think like they're not going to compete. Like you said earlier, I think they're going to compete next year. So I just don't think you move on from those kind of guys. Ohtani, I don't think it happens. It depends on what goes on in the next week or however long it is to the trade deadline. But if it's going to be a trade, it's not going to be what they want. It's not going to be this 5 mega prospect deal. If it happens, it's going to be like a Juan Soto deal where they just threw you a couple players that might be good and some prospects. I don't think it's going to be some crazy mega deal, but I really don't think it happens at all.
And I think
yeah, go ahead.
The difference between Juan Soto, though, is that Juan Soto had 2 years left. Like
right.
he had all of last year, the half last year, and then he has this year and next year. Right. So the Padres sent over a pretty decent haul. Like they sent over most of their top prospects. Mm-hmm. And like we can talk about Shohei later, but I just don't think people realistically understand how trades work. And like I get Shohei's like a once in a lifetime talent, but it's only a couple months, and then you have to shell out if you want to keep him. The bare minimum, it sounds like it's starting off at like 400, and most teams can't afford that.
Wow. Right.
So, but back to what you were saying.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. I forgot how much Juan Soto had on his contract, but we'll move on to the two that might happen. Let's start in San Diego. Blake Snell has been pitching real good out there, man. Cy Young level Blake Snell. He looks like he's back in Tampa after almost killing Bryce Harper, but we'll bounce over that. But the Padres, I mean, do they really think that they're going to compete? I know they're really close, but the Diamondbacks have been real good. The Dodgers are the Dodgers. You have some pitching depth. I think that he might get moved for a haul if a team like the Braves, maybe somebody in the AL probably. But Blake Snell is an interesting name. And then the other one, I think one of the Mets guys gets moved. You said like the Cardinals, that they want to see if they can compete next year. I think the Mets move one of these big contracts to clear up some space in the offseason. I think Steve Cohen, he doesn't want to sit on his hands when all these big names are going to be in the free agent pool on a 39-year-old and a 40-year-old. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that Scherzer is probably more likely to be the one, just because Verlander is probably a little better, even though he's a year older. He's coming off a Cy Young year. Scherzer's going downhill always after the dead arm era. So I think that Scherzer might get moved to one of these teams, like you said, that doesn't need a guy that's going to be top end. That's just going to get a lot of innings for you and hover around that 4 ERA.
Yeah, and then we've mentioned earlier, we're kind of iffy on what are the Padres and Mets going to do? Like, are they going to sell? Or I think Blake Snell just makes sense to get traded. Yeah. I just think the Padres are too stingy to sell, and I think they'll probably stand pat. I don't think you'll see them buy, but they're going to say, all right, we put this roster together filled with all-stars from the past. Let's try to compete. But it's a steep hill, like you mentioned, the Dodgers, the Diamondbacks, the Giants. They've been playing really good the past couple months. And I think they're second place right now. It's a really tight division race. The wild card is probably their best shot. But even then, it's similar. I think they're 8 games back from the Dodgers, and then they're 10 games back in the wild card standing. And it's pretty much them and the Mets that are like going back and forth in that. So the Mets are the same way. I don't think they really sell off major assets. Getting Scherzer or Verlander dealt is going to take a lot because they're due so much money that I'm going to need the Mets to eat some of that contract. if you want a decent prospect, and even then, you're not going to get the best prospects from Max Scherzer, who's pushing 40.
Right.
And Verlander, I think just because he signed, I think it was a 3-year deal.
Yeah.
So they'll probably let him get another shot for next year when they retool. But Scherzer, he makes sense to get dealt. It just depends what team really wants him. And then I think no matter what, if they get moved, you have to eat that contract. But in terms of shocking trades, like you mentioned, Ohtani, we'll talk about a little bit later and get more opinions on that. But I think a big one that could be shocking, and we already mentioned it, I think the O's go all in this year. Not super all in, like trading away their entire farm, but I think they make a big move to improve not only their outfield, with Cedric Mullins kind of fluctuating on the injured list, back and forth, but also their starting pitching is pretty awful. I mean, you were at the Orioles Dodgers game. I watched it. Most of their starters have an ERA over 4. So that's something they definitely need to address. And why not just go all in on Dylan Cease and pair him up with Luis Robert? I think you could get a haul with that because Robert has almost 3 or 4 years left on his deal. If you're not going to be competing that long, you might as well sell high, get him off the team. He's having an MVP level year this year. And Dylan Cease would just immediately become the ace of that rotation, starting game 1 of either the wild card or the division series.
Don't disrespect Kyle Gibson like that, man.
But, I think that would be the shocking one. And it would just shock everyone because, the idea of trading Luis Robert hasn't really gone to many people's heads. But these types of teams that can't really afford the big contracts, they start selling their guys a little bit earlier than what you would think. And the White Sox, they're going to be down bad after this deadline, especially if they trade away a lot of these players that we're saying they're going to trade, where they may not be competing until the next 4 years, maybe at the minimum. And their division's pretty awful. I mean, the AL Central is winnable. I mean, the Tigers are technically still in contention to win it. But, the White Sox are going to have to make some big decisions. And I think the O's, last year they stood pat at the deadline, kind of just went see what their guys could do. But they have so many prospects now. The drafting that they've done since their old GM got fired has been pretty, almost probably arguably the best in baseball. So they have guys that they can move. I definitely think a couple guys are off limits. I still think you can get Luis Robert without giving up guys like Jackson Holiday. You can give up a couple other guys. But that would be my big move for the deadline, unless it was Shohei, which we'll segue to it right now. But Shohei Ohtani, you mentioned he's not getting moves. What do you think? Why don't you think he gets moved?
I just like you said. First off, I wanted to tell you 4.20 ERA for the Orioles. Dylan Cease, that would be beautiful. But I just think, like you said, it's too big of a deal. I think it's a $400 million player at minimum. At minimum, probably pushes over 500 in my opinion. I think closer to that range. But if you're the Angels, you have this hottest thing in that baseball ever created, and what are you gonna do? Go and take the number 10th ranked prospect in somebody's system? But nobody's gonna sit down and let me mortgage my future so I can get 4 months of Shohei Ohtani or pay him $500 million.
So say it's looking a little less likely now because the Yankees couldn't beat the Angels. Now the Angels are only, I think, 2 teams away from being on that third wild card spot. Maybe 5 or less games behind, which is realistic. From now, we still got half the season left. Say they go on a skid, they lose a string of games. Either some other players get hurt. Shohei looks depressed over there. What are some realistic teams that could actually make a trade with the Angels?
Whew, that's tough. I think just off the top of my head, I have 2 contenders, and I think I have 1 extension. Honestly, let's start there. I think the White Sox might be interesting if they give up some guys, and if they plan on extending. That's the
White
only
Sox.
reason.
If it's the White Sox, Shohei's going back to Japan.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
That's
That's what I mean. If they're gonna be like, Shohei, here's $600 million. I don't care. Just come and own Chicago for a little bit. Then yes, but it would be tough, obviously. But the contenders, the Dodgers, we talked about it. You talked about it a ton. We don't have to beat the dead horse. The Dodgers have what they have in the system. I mean, one of the best teams in drafting and developing. A lot of fringe talent that could go, like in the Juan Soto trade that you had Mackenzie Gore, CJ Abrams, those guys that are on the cusp. The Dodgers could do that. But I also like the Orioles. The Orioles are just like the Dodgers in the AL. They're a little bit younger, a little bit worse, but huge farm system, a lot of fringe guys, a lot of depth in the outfield. Like Colton Cowser, not even getting a lot of playing time. Aaron Hicks is playing well. Why not ride him and go get maybe the best player in the last 30 years?
Yeah. I'm definitely going to agree with you on one, but I have one that hasn't really been mentioned because it's not something they really do. And I'll start segueing to the obvious. We tweeted about it the other day. I think the Angels are kind of stingy. It doesn't really make sense for them not to hear out the Dodgers trade offer.
Right.
The Dodgers aren't going to trade for him because they're just not going to. Why would you trade for somebody and give up so many top prospects to then just have to sign him? You could just sign him for $500 million in a couple months.
Right.
And do the Dodgers need Shohei? It'd be nice, but then what do you do with JD Martinez, who was an all-star? Shohei can't play the field. He'll get too tired. He can't pitch, and
right.
There's a bunch of things. So, but to not entertain offers from the Dodgers, I mean, the Dodgers have had the top 3 farm systems for years now, and they have so many pitchers on their top 20 that are in the MLB top 100. And what do the Angels need? They need pitching. They've never had good pitching. And there's a couple guys that you could still trade away. Like, I think realistically, if the Dodgers wanted to get it done and the Angels and Artie Moreno wasn't as spiteful against the Dodgers, that they could get a trade done without giving up like Bobby Miller and Gavin Stone, just because there's the starting pitching in the minors is so deep. But I think a big one that I would say could realistically happen that would be a shocking trade. Tampa.
I knew it.
Tampa is playing for a couple reasons. One, this is probably the best team they've had in, I would say, probably their franchise. I mean, 2008, they had that wasn't a good team. They just went on a good run.
Got lucky.
And 2020, they had a really good team, but it was a shortened season, so you can't really get that big sample size. I mean, they almost won the World Series, came up just short. But they're playing for a new stadium. What way to drive in money and open up those upper deck seats than bring in Shohei Ohtani? And they have probably the deepest farm system in sports, and they could trade those guys away and easily replenish them. They're so good at drafting and development, and they're so similar to the Dodgers. They're just cheaper, but they do the same thing. And I think if you're going to go all in, like the Rays need to win a World Series. If you're going to bring baseball to Florida, you got to win a World Series. I think the Marlins were so popular in the early 2000s because, one, they were an expansion team, and they were an expansion team that won 2 World. Then they won twice. They beat the Indians, and then they beat the Yankees. So the Rays, I mean, they've been playing so well. A trade for Shohei just kind of makes so much sense, and he would instantly, like, for the division that's as tight as it is, I think the Rays need to win now. And they need to go all in, put all the chips in, and get Ohtani. That would be my big one. But if he's traded, but like you said, I absolutely do not think the Angels trade Ohtani because I think they want to keep Ohtani. And Ohtani, I feel like if they made the playoffs, I think Ohtani would stay there, realistically. But the Rays wouldn't be able to extend him; it would just be for this stretch of games. So, but other than that, moving on. Dodgers fan, Phillies fan, kind of on 2 different trajectories.
Right.
Kind of got to think of where do you see your division and then playoffs, and then who do you want your team to trade for?
Yeah, I liked the expanded playoffs last year. No bias at all, but I think that it leaves our division open. I think the Braves, as we know, are going to run away with it. They're 10 games above us. They're one of the dirtiest teams in the last decade. But I think the Phillies have a clear shot at second. I mean, the Marlins are the Marlins, but it just doesn't look
And they've been
how it
skidding.
should. Right. They lost 6 straight. It just doesn't look like how it should look. You know what I mean? That doesn't look like a playoff, championship contender. I think the Phillies need to add a few people. I picked out 3 different levels. So we're starting at the top. This is top. If Dave Dombrowski comes and brings his, little magic, his little Hunter Pence, Matt Stairs magic, Dylan Cease, why not? Dylan Cease would be electric in Philly. I already said I'm out on Nola. I just claimed that now, so hopefully he starts snapping. But Dylan Cease could be that guy. You have him for a couple of years. You can always work on an extension. He's just disgusting. But again, we don't know how much it would take to get him. My middle, more realistic one, I want to go with the Bellinger and Hendricks deal. I think that Bellinger fits the Phillies perfectly. They need another power bat. They need another outfielder, and they need another first baseman behind Bryce Harper. I think Derek Hall wasn't good enough. Pache, Rojas, while they're doing some good things out there, it's just not what Cody Bellinger would do out there. And then Kyle Hendricks brings some, calm to the rotation. We have a lot of spikes where we go really good, where Nola, 7 innings, 10 strikeouts, and then the next he gives up 6 runs in 4 innings. Same thing with Zach Wheeler this year. Ranger gets unlucky at times because of his pitch repertoire, like his sinkers and his cutters. But Hendricks gets outs. Like you said, he'll come in there and get outs for you. Heavy command, will be able to do whatever you need. And the final one that I really like, has been talked about a little bit more recently, is All-Star Michael Lorenzen. I should have said this earlier, but he's down to a 3.59 ERA. Everybody was, shitting on him because he's got a 4 ERA and he's in the All-Star game, and now he's got a 3.59. I think he's got really good stuff. I've always really liked him. He was a fun story, but he's got good stuff. He's been pitching really good for the Tigers. Another, Kyle Hendricks kind of guy that'll get you some innings, get some outs, and bring some stability to your rotation.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The Phillies, they're in a win now mode. You sign Trey Turner, you get all these guys. Bryce Harper's finally back, semi-healthy because now he's playing first base.
Right.
You have to win now, and that's Dave Dombrowski. I've joked with it to you, kiss your farm system goodbye. I'm surprised Andrew Painter and what's the other one, Mick Abel.
Mick Abel.
I'm surprised they haven't been traded yet, which may just speak how highly they are in the Philly system and what they think. But Dave Dombrowski is a winning GM. He's been in the league forever, and he definitely will be on the prowl. Like you said, the Marlins, they don't look like a playoff team. They just end up getting lucky in a lot of their games.
Right.
Their pitching's been all over the place. But yeah, the Phillies can realistically get second place. Like you said, the division, I think, is just straight out of the water. Braves are having a really great year.
Right.
But, like we mentioned, you don't got to win 111 games because the Dodgers did it last year and got eliminated the first round. The Braves
87.
Won.
Braves won
the Braves,
over 100. The Phillies won 87 games.
Yeah, and then even the same Braves 2 years ago, they won the World Series when they won the division with 88 games or 89 games. The Nationals did the year prior. At least they had I think they had 93 that year. The NL was pretty hefty. But going with the Dodgers, we've talked about it at Dodgers Beat when I'm on there, but definitely number one is starting pitching, and it's not elite starting pitching. It's just, can you throw me a couple innings starting pitching? The Dodgers farm system, they have a lot of good rookies, guys that are down there, but that can't be your entire rotation. You've mentioned it. That's just bad roster construction at that point. You can't throw all these rookies out there because they're going to struggle. And I've already seen it. Bobby Miller gets called up. Amazing. Then his next couple starts, awful. And now it seems like the league's kind of figured him out. He can't really get out of the fifth inning without giving up at least 3 or 4 runs. I've already mentioned it. Definitely Jordan Montgomery's like my number one guy to go after because he's a rental. He won't cost a lot, but I just think there's going to be so many teams after him that it may up his price to where it's not worth it. I think the Dodgers trade for Lucas Giolito. I think there's been so many rumors about it. He's from LA. And I think I don't know why, but it just keeps getting thrown out there. I just think Tim Anderson gets traded to the Dodgers. I don't know what they see in him just because he's been so awful this year.
Yeah.
And he's not that good at defense. And I'd rather, if I'm going to have a bad hitting shortstop, I'd rather just keep having Miguel Rojas out there because at least he's an elite defender.
Right.
And they've kind of changed up their game where since they sent Miguel Vargas down, Mookie Betts has played every single game except today at second base, which seems to be one of his favorite positions to play. So I do think the Dodgers trade for Giolito. I think they package it with Tim Anderson just so the White Sox can offload him, get him to another team. He has a club option, but I think the Dodgers would probably decline it. With Lux coming back next season, and they still have Rojas, who they signed to an extension, I think, for 2 years. And then I started talking about the other day, and you mentioned a pretty good name. Dodgers need a backup catcher, and it's rare to see catchers traded. And the Dodgers have like 3 guys in the minors that you could easily just call up. But if they're not going to go that route, Austin Barnes just isn't serviceable behind there anymore. He's been one of the worst players. He used to be okay, like calling games and being back there, but I just don't think that's enough value. You have to at least hit above the Mendoza line. I'll go with another guy from the Cubs, Yan Gomes. He's been all over the place. He's a serviceable hitting catcher. Pitchers like pitching to him. He played for the Guardians and the Indians half of their tenure there. And he was pretty good there. They had a lot of good pitching there. And then I'll stay in the NL Central. What's his name from the Pirates? Austin Hedges.
Austin Hedges, yeah.
Yeah, he's definitely a guy who can hit a little bit better than Barnes. Free agent after the year. Definitely could be somebody that the Dodgers could go after. But realistically, I think they just would go within, maybe phantom IL stint for Barnes and then call up. They wouldn't call up Curtaya. They would probably call up Hunter Fiducia, who's 26 years old in Double-A. So probably time to promote him. And then the last one is just right-handed bat off the bench, specifically outfielder. I mentioned Duvall, but I don't think he's getting traded. I think the Red Sox, if anything, buy a little bit, look for some guys that they can have under team control. I would say Tommy Pham's a good ideal fit. I don't know if I love it a lot because I don't really like Tommy Pham as a person. But anything to give us a win.
I don't think the Dodgers fans would like it either.
Yeah, I don't think the Dodgers fans like it. When he came to when the New York Mets came here, they didn't like him. Plus, they didn't like him because he slapped
Jock.
So yeah, so but if you need a right-handed bat, specifically in the outfield, they signed Jake Marisnick, who ended up, I think he went like 3 for 3 in his first 3 at bats. Then he tore his hamstring, so he's out. I mentioned to you the other day that Taylor has like lingering knee problems. He's back, but he still says that like he feels the pain when he's playing. So, and knee issues aren't no joke, especially when you're running around the outfield. And I don't know how many other good right-handed bats they have. I think you could go crazy off the Cardinals. Isn't Paul DeJong a right-handed hitter?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Power bat.
That's another guy that the Cardinals could probably sell. They can call up, who is it? Wins as their shortstop.
Yeah, Justin Wins.
Yeah, they could just call him up and say, all right, get MLB ready. Young, we loved you. Go over there. Go to LA. But definitely I could see that. And if they don't trade for Giolito, Jack Flaherty, I mean, he's a free agent.
Right.
We barely mentioned him, and he's one of those guys that the Cardinals are probably likely going to move. He did get lit up today, though. So kind of just depends on what you want. So the Dodgers have a bunch of options. I don't think this is a year you go all in if you're the Dodgers. I value our prospects, but I always will make the best deal if it gives you the best players. But the only best player that I would give up a good amount of prospects for is Ohtani, and it's just not going to happen. And I think they bit the bullet. They traded for superstars in the past, and this is just one of the years that they're still going to be competitive, but they're not looking for this year. They're looking for the future. If they make the playoffs and win the World Series, okay, great. But the next time they go all in would probably be next year or the year after. So it kind of just goes down to that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I don't think it'll be a Manny Machado, a Max Scherzer, or somebody like that. But I think it will be a at least a mid-level pitcher. I think Giolito is pretty obvious. It's been a lot of talks between them, and why not? Looks like he's fit. Dodgers can pay him his 10 mil, whatever it is. Tim Anderson was interesting. I like that you added that. Why not? Like you said,
I just think it's been linked
right.
since when Gavin Lux went down with the torn ACL. Literally, that's the only name I've heard. And at the beginning of the season, it didn't make sense because it just seemed like the White Sox were still going to be contending. Tim Anderson has been a good player the past 3 seasons, but now he's just tanked his value. And the White Sox, they could have him pick up his option and let him play next year, but I just don't see that happening. I just feel like and Giolito's not going to get you a lot. Like we talked about trades and like what people see. Like I've seen White Sox fans say, "Oh, we need Diego Cartaya." I was like, "You want the Dodgers' #1 position player prospect
Right.
for Giolito, who has a career like 4 ERA?" Like Giolito's had a lot of highs, but he's also had a lot of lows, and that's even this year. And you could realistically go 1-for-1. I would say if the Dodgers were going to make a trade, Ryan Pepiot for Lucas Giolito, it would work. They get a controllable pitcher. We get a pitcher that's already major league ready. And Pepiot's on a rehab assignment. He hasn't pitched this year, but it definitely is something that they can get done. And then Paul DeYoung, just something I've been hearing a lot recently, because it's just the Cardinals, they're going to retool. They've said that they're going to sell, but they're looking to sell to compete for 2024.
Right.
So that's offloading guys that have been on the team for a while that just really haven't been super productive. You mentioned Tyler O'Neill. I feel like if he stays, that'd be shocking.
Yeah.
Just because of all the stuff. I think he got activated recently. I think today or yesterday. But Tyler O'Neill's the guy you can trade away. Brendan Donovan is another name that they've been throwing around. Dylan Carlson, just these guys that have been hanging around. Like, get these prospects up, trade them away, get some starting pitching, and then you could easily compete in that division next year. So, all in all, I mean, I think it's going to be an interesting deadline. Watch Ohtani just get traded after we just
right now as we're doing this.
Yeah. There's always those wire trades that come down right at the deadline, August 1st. It's 6 p.m. Eastern time this year, since they eliminated the waiver trade deadline, I think last year or the year before. Definitely could see a lot of players move. There's a bunch of guys we haven't mentioned that are definitely going to get moved, but it's still definitely going to be an interesting trade deadline. I'm really interested to see what happens and how the season progresses from here on out. Because, if you're to a casual baseball fan, opening day, trade deadline, postseason, that's what you're looking for. So, and both of our teams are looking to make the playoffs. So it just depends on what they're going to do.
Yeah, man, I'm right there with you. Let's go Phils, man. I think we just got to compete. Philly's got to make a couple moves. I mean, you always just one team's going to make that big move, that Eddie Rosario, that Jorge Soler, that random move that didn't seem like much that wins them a championship. So we're just going to see who it is this year.
All right, yeah. So this is episode 1. We talked about the MLB trade deadline. Be sure to follow us at the Diamond Club 0 on all our socials. But other than that, Diamond Club off.
Peace.